So now we're live there, Conor, now. So we'll just wait for people to join in. They're coming in here now.
Yep.
We'll just give it a minute or two before we kick off. And I'm delighted, Conor, you could join us this morning. Thanks so much for taking the time out. I think it's timely as well to have a discussion around this kind of topic this time of the year. So people are still joining there now. We'll just give it another minute or so. Yeah, I think I'll start kicking off now. We're just 11 there, so I might just give another second. Yeah, there's still a few more to join. Okay, I think we'll make a start now. So I'd just like to welcome everybody to this morning's webinar, a New Year Outlook for the Northern Ireland Economy with Conor Lambe of Danske Bank. And delighted that Conor was able to join us this morning for this, which I hope is going to be a really interesting session. And my name is Paul Clancy and I'm the CEO of the London Dairy Chamber. And delighted that so many of us could join this morning. Just a bit about the event overview for this morning. It's the economy stupid is an often quoted phrase first used by strategists in Bill Clinton's successful 1992 presidential campaign against the incumbent George Bush. Whilst this may not be Washington and the presidential campaign of 2020 is behind us, the economy in Northern Ireland has certainly suffered during successive lockdowns of the COVID pandemic, and we're all keen to hear what 2021 holds in store. So Conor Lambe, Danske Bank's chief economist, will talk us through the impact of the 2020's fall in output and presents his predictions for when the economy will start to recover and what the economic indicators are saying. And is it too early to talk about green shoots? Just a little bit about Conor. Conor is responsible for the bank's economic analysis and forecasts, writing regularly opinion articles for the Northern Irish media and frequently speaking at local business events. Economic analysis is often a useful tool for many businesses and can help you understand what is driving the performance of the economy and whether current trends are likely to continue, as well as what the implications could mean for your business. So look, you have the option to text questions, and we would encourage you, please do. Conor's going to take us through a short presentation, but we would like you to ask as many questions as you possibly can in the text box down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll endeavour to get through them as quickly as we can and as efficiently as we can. So maybe without further ado, Conor, if I could ask you to share your screen and we go through the presentations. I say, please, we'd encourage people to ask questions and put them in the text box and we'll work through them after the presentation. So thanks, Conor.
Thanks, Paul, and good morning, everybody. Just hopefully the slides will come up shortly. Paul, if you can just let me know if those, those appear on the screen.
Yes, they're fine. If you want to share, yeah, that's fine. They're perfect.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you today. My name's Conor Lambe. I'm the Chief Economist at Danske Bank. I'm going to take some time this morning to speak through the impacts of the pandemic on the Northern Ireland and UK economies over 2020, what some of the latest data is telling us, and then give some of my thoughts around how the economy might perform over the next 12 months. So if we begin at a national level looking at the UK economy, we have figures for the first 3 quarters of 2020 now. And what I've plotted on this graph is overall UK GDP, so this is the blue line, consumer spending, which is the red line, and business investment, which is the grey line. And as we're all aware, the period of lockdown in the first half of 2020 led to a very sharp decline in economic activity across all parts of the economy. The third quarter of the year, I think it's interesting for us to look at how consumers and businesses reacted in the third quarter of last year as the initial coronavirus restrictions began to be eased. So you'll see that at an overall GDP level, after that big drop in the second quarter of the year, we saw a reasonably strong rate of growth in 2020 quarter 3. And consumer spending tracked a fairly similar path to the overall economy. Now, to some extent, this is to be expected. Consumer spending makes up over 60% of overall GDP, so the two normally move quite closely together. But I think a big part of that strong growth that we saw on the consumer side of the economy was due to the pent-up demand that we have heard about. So there were a number of people who perhaps hadn't been as impacted by the pandemic, were able to adapt to working from home and weren't placed on furlough, were still earning their full salary, had built up some savings and were able to spend during that third quarter of the year. And we also saw the likes of the Eat Out to Help Out scheme and other measures to try and encourage economic activity on the consumer side of the economy. And we did, broadly speaking, see that. From a business perspective, things were a little bit different. So you'll see that business investment did increase in the third quarter of the year, but at a much more modest pace. And this was, I think, really due to the high levels of uncertainty in the economy at the time, both related to the pandemic, but also around Brexit. And typically, high uncertainty levels tend to lead to a more subdued business investment climate. And even UK-wide, since the Brexit referendum in 2016 and the uncertainty that brought, has been a more modest business investment climate. But in that third quarter of the year, with those two big risks prevailing, the business investment part of the recovery wasn't quite as strong as we saw on the consumer side. Now, in Northern Ireland, we collect and publish economic data in a slightly different way rather than a national economy. So we don't have that same breakdown of GDP and consumer spending and business investment. What we have is what's termed the Northern Ireland Composite Economic Index. And this is effectively a proxy for economic activity here locally. And similar to the UK, we saw relatively strong growth in Northern Ireland in the third quarter of last year. Again, that's the most latest and up-to-date data that we have. And those figures are collected more on a sectoral basis. So what you can see is that the three main parts of the private sector economy, so construction, services and production activity in Northern Ireland, again, all showed reasonably strong rates of growth in Q3 last year as those restrictions were being eased. And that's a little bit of a flavour of what we're seeing in the economic output data. From a labour market perspective, the government policy measures that have been put in place have provided some protection to jobs. And it's probably true to say that the true labour market impacts of the pandemic are perhaps still to be felt. But what we had seen more recently is some deterioration in the labour market. And I've plotted two measures of unemployment in this chart. So the blue one is the claimant count, and that captures people who are claiming benefits or support payments primarily for the purposes of being unemployed. And you can see that increased very sharply almost at the very beginning of the pandemic. It has settled down and come down a little bit since then, but that was perhaps a more timely measure. The labour force survey, which is the more regularly talked about unemployment rate, had started to increase over the last number of months. Now, we actually got some data published just this morning, and interestingly, that showed that the red line there, that unemployment rate, actually dropped a little bit over the September to November period. It went from 3.9 to 3.2%. I don't think we can draw too much optimism from that, really. Perhaps it's partly captured by people becoming economically inactive rather than unemployed. But I think it is fair to say that the labour market impacts are still truly to be felt. And even though looking at this chart, you can see unemployment isn't as high as it was in the years during and just after the financial crisis, but yet it is a bit higher than it was prior to the onset of the pandemic. And in fact, if we look even at some of the more perhaps leading indicators of these official statistics from a redundancy perspective, over the 12 months to November, as I've plotted in this chart, the number of proposed redundancies was the highest on record, and the number of confirmed redundancies was also significantly higher than in previous years. And again, those new figures published this morning just emphasise this trend. I think it was 1,000 total redundancies were proposed throughout the year of 2020. So that does signal that there may be some challenging times ahead for the labour market, particularly if some of those government support schemes come to an end. So as we look into 2021, I think there are perhaps 5 key factors which are likely to impact the performance of the Northern Ireland economy. The first one is the extent of restrictions that are there to limit the spread of coronavirus. And we've talked about the data that's taken us up to 2020 Q3. From the fourth quarter of last year, we began to see an increase in the amount of restrictions needed to control the virus. So in October time, we had a 4-week period of restrictions which kicked in, I think, from around the middle of the month. We then had the 2-week circuit breaker towards the end of November. And then from Boxing Day, we entered into the current lockdown period. And with that now extended until at least the first week of March, what we will have seen is a period of relatively stringent restrictions in both the final quarter of 2020 and the first quarter of 2021. And that being the case, our expectation is that the economy probably shrank again in both of those 2 quarters. Now, the one positive that we have at this stage that we didn't have in the early part of the pandemic was we now have the vaccine, and the vaccine is being rolled out. And assuming that the vaccine rollout continues at a reasonably strong pace, and that allows the restrictions to be gradually eased as we move through 2021, our hope is that the recovery in Northern Ireland would begin again from the second quarter of this year onwards. So that's some hope that we can try and take from the current situation. I think it's also worth noting that even those contractions that we expect to see at the end of last year and the first quarter of this year are unlikely to be as severe as they were in the early part of 2020 when we saw that big drop in activity. That's partly because some sectors that were closed back then have remained open, such as construction and manufacturing. And it's also because some other industries have perhaps been able to adapt a little bit more to the environment in which we're operating now. So we have the likes of retail businesses that have been able to adjust to online business and conducting sales online now. A large number of them would already have been doing that prior to the pandemic, but I think those that weren't are perhaps do that now. So those drops at the end of last year and the start of this year hopefully won't be as severe as they were in the first half of 2020. I had touched there on the expected weakening that we think we're going to see in the labour market, and I do think that is a trend that unfortunately will come to pass over the next few months. And that's also partly just reflecting the fact that there are a number of businesses still impacted by restrictions. And I think the recovery from this pandemic will be a gradual one. So it will take some time for economic activity levels to return to where they were prior to the pandemic. And whenever the government support mechanisms such as the furlough scheme come to an end, I think that's also going to have an impact on the unemployment figures that we're seeing. And as people become unemployed, there will be knock-on consequences for consumer spending and indeed wider economic growth. I also think we're likely to see a degree of caution from both people and businesses with regards to their spending decisions. So with an expectation of unemployment rising and with high uncertainty levels perhaps around the pandemic, I think that consumers, even once places start to open up again, I would expect to see reasonably strong consumer spending growth, but there will be some caution in there as people perhaps don't spend all the money that they've been able to save, or just a little bit more cautious about how much they're actually prepared to go out and spend. On the business side as well, I think there will be firms who, once they're in a position to do so, decide to prioritise either rebuilding their cash reserves or paying down debt rather than focusing on investing in new strategic opportunities. So I think there's going to be some caution there, and that's going to constrain the pace of economic growth and the recovery. We're also seeing the extra trade frictions due to Brexit. So at the end of last year, we saw the UK and EU agree their trade and cooperation agreement, which took effect from the early part of this year alongside the Northern Ireland Protocol. And we've seen some of those new trade frictions and the impacts that they're having on firms. And I think it is going to take businesses in Northern Ireland and across the UK some time to adjust to that. And that is going to have an impact on the pace of economic growth, certainly in the short term. But on the positive side, we think some of the measures put in place by policymakers will help to facilitate a return to economic growth. So clearly the measures put in place by the government, such as the furlough scheme or support grants to businesses or the government-backed loan schemes, have been an important part of helping businesses through the disruption of the pandemic. and I suspect they're going to play an important role in helping them to recover from those impacts as well. Or from a Bank of England perspective, they've cut interest rates to an historic low of 0.1% in the early part of last year. Our expectation is that they will stay at that 0.1% throughout 2021. So again, providing some impetus into the economy from a policy side. So to try and put some numbers around that, our expectation is in Northern Ireland, the economy contracted by around 11% in 2020. And we think that the rate of economic growth in 2021 will be around 4%. So that's lower than the 7% that we had projected in our last set of forecasts. And that's just reflecting the new restrictions that we have got now, and that weaker end to last year and weaker start to 2021. At a UK level, we expect to see broadly similar numbers, and perhaps a little bit less of a severe contraction in 2020 and a little bit stronger in 2021, but broadly similar. We do see unemployment in average terms increasing in 2021, and inflation is also likely to increase a little bit as well. From a sector perspective, I'll maybe just jump onto the next slide for this. What we do as part of our forecasting is we look at the likely rates of economic growth from an output perspective across 19 of the largest sectors of the economy. And I'm not going to speak to all of them here, but I will just point to a few if that's okay. From a 2020 perspective, our expectation is that the consumer-focused sectors likely experience the biggest falls in activity. So that's the likes of accommodation and food, so your hospitals, your arts and firms, or other services activities, which mainly captures things like hairdressers and beauticians and some of those close contact services. We think they probably saw the biggest falls in activity. For manufacturing and construction, they sit around the middle of this table in the 2020 impacts, again recognizing that they were perhaps able to stay open at the latter parts of the year in ways that some of those other industries weren't. Retail trade, we think the fall in 2020 is probably just slightly over 10%. Not quite as big a drop as some of those other consumer-focused industries. And I think that reflects some of the points that we've already talked about. So that shift to online retailing, that little boost that parts of the retail sector got last summer. And I suppose as well as that, the fact that some areas of retail, such as essential retail and supermarkets, have seen activity levels hold up relatively well. So still a big drop in activity, but not quite to the same extent as some other consumer-focused sectors. While for some industries like professional services or information and communication, where people are more able to adapt to working from home, again, we think there'll be falls in activity in 2020, but towards the more modest end of the range of the full 19 sectors, with only public administration expected to see an increase in activity in 2020, just due to the increased demands for public services during the pandemic. In 2021, we're hopeful that all sectors of the economy will expand, but you'll perhaps just see from looking at some of the numbers there that our expectation is that it's going to take a bit of time for all industries to get back to the activity levels that they were at prior to the pandemic. So even, for example, reasonably strong growth of 16.5% in hospitality there in 2021 isn't going to make up for the 39% drop that we saw in 2020. So it is going to take some time to get back to where we were. From a labour market perspective, our expectation is that for 2020 as a whole, the average number of jobs in the economy likely declined by about 0.3%. But we think there's going to be a bigger decline in average terms in 2021 of around 3%. And I just want to explain this a little because we have figures for the first 3 quarters of 2020. And if you look at some of the sectors on there, you'll see quite a lot of them are actually expected to experience an increase in employment in 2020. The reason that we will decline is that some of the industries that employ the largest numbers of people, so the likes of manufacturing and retail trade, and you can see this in the chart on the right, which shows the actual number of jobs in each sector. They're industries where we think employment is going to unfortunately decline. So in overall terms, when we take the declines in those big sectors from an employment perspective, we see a decline in the overall number of jobs. The likes of electricity, they're up at the top of the list with almost 12% growth. It's actually on the chart on the right, you'll see it's the smallest sector in terms of people it employs. So even though it's quite a high percentage number in terms of actual jobs added, it's relatively low. In 2021, we think that the most impacted sectors from a labour market perspective are probably going to be those that have suffered the most so far. So it's your consumer-focused businesses, their accommodation and arts and entertainment, likely to see over 7% drops in employment. Whereas some of those home working industries that we talked about, like professional services, perhaps maybe around 2%, a little bit less than the average for the overall economy. But we do unfortunately think there is going to be some further deterioration in the labour market yet to come. I think then, just to emphasise the point about the gradual recovery, what I've tried to plot here is how we see economic activity evolving on a quarterly basis out to the end of last year, or sorry, to the end of this current year. And you'll see that big drop there in the first part of 2020, then the increase in Q3, and then the fall, and then the beginning of a gradual recovery. But you'll see even in the final quarter of 2021, is that economic activity will still be lower than it was at the end of 2019, which we're taking as our pre-pandemic level of economic output. And then I think it's just important to contextualize and recognize the amount of risks and uncertainties which could impact the economy over this year. Clearly, the coronavirus pandemic is the biggest risk facing the economy. So we've already seen the initial 6-week lockdown period extended by around a month or so. If that were to be extended even further, or if tighter restrictions had to be introduced, or even if we were in a position where restrictions had to be introduced later in the year, those would all likely slow the pace of the economic recovery even further. Likewise, if consumers and businesses were to behave even more cautiously than we've assumed, again, there would in all likelihood be adverse impacts on the rate of economic growth. We've touched on some of the disruption related to the end of the Brexit transition period, and I've made the point that it's likely going to take firms some time to adapt and adjust to those changes that are now needed. But if it takes firms longer to do that, or if it costs them more to make those adaptations, again, there will be impacts on the pace of growth there. And I think it's important to recognise as well that this is a global pandemic, and that economies are intrinsically interlinked. So we've already seen new variants of the virus, like the Brazilian variant or the South African variant. And if we were to find ourselves in a position where those new variants were having impact on countries around the world, then the expectation that we have of a sharp recession in 2020 with the beginning of a recovery at a global level in 2021 may prove to be even more challenging, and we may well see, if there's different economies that have to bring in lockdowns and restrictions at different times, knock-on impacts on global trade flows and more scarring effects at a global level, with unemployment running at higher rates and business insolvencies higher than would otherwise have been the case. And that has knock-on consequences perhaps for local businesses who do sell a lot in international markets. So it's just important to remember that there's a global element of this pandemic which can have knock-on impacts for Northern Ireland and the UK as well. So I think, to sum up, a challenging end to 2020 and unfortunately a challenging start to 2021. The vaccine gives us some hope. Hoping that from the second quarter of the year, as that vaccine program rolls out, that we can start to see some opening up of the economy again, though it will likely be gradual, and that will see the recovery take hold. And hopefully, unlike the third quarter of last year, where we had some recovery and then things took a turn for the worse, hopefully if it takes hold again in the second quarter of this year, that can be on an ongoing basis. So some things that we can take some hope from, but a challenging period for us in the short term. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to pause there, and I will happily take any questions or comments. So thank you.
Conor, thanks so much for that. Would you like to stop your share there? That's brilliant. Excellent. Look, and we have some questions coming in, Conor, as well from the attendees. But I wanted to ask you just a question for yourself. To what extent will consumer confidence be an important factor in the recovery for the coronavirus pandemic? I mean, you talked about businesses being cautious, but I guess consumers still have the same issues as well. You know, they want to maybe build up their reserves a little bit and also paying down debt that may have incurred as well.
Yes, I think consumer confidence is going to be quite an important part of the recovery. So at Danske Bank, we publish a Northern Ireland Consumer Confidence Index on a quarterly basis. And our most recent report was from the third quarter of last year. And what we actually, so that survey took place in September, so it was around the time that the case numbers were starting to increase again, but it was before the October restrictions were announced. But even at that stage, we saw confidence levels drop back a bit from where they were at the time of our June survey. And consumers were telling us at that stage that it was perhaps unsurprisingly, you know, the pandemic, Brexit, and the weaker performance of the economy that was weighing on their confidence levels. I think as we go through 2021, again, the extent of consumer confidence will be quite important. And the reason for that is consumers tend to spend more when they're more optimistic and when confidence is higher. So if we're going to see those sort of strong rates of consumer spending growth that we saw in the third quarter last year, if we're going to see that again this year, we would need to see reasonably optimistic and high sentiment levels among consumers. I'm hopeful that we might see some confidence return as we go through this year and the vaccine gets rolled out. As I mentioned in the presentation, I do still think there's going to be some caution there on the consumer side, but hopefully confidence levels will start to build as we go through the year, and that will help support the economy to take hold. But again, I think it's going to take a little bit of time.
Okay, Conor, thanks very much. I'm going to go through to some of the questions coming in here from the attendees now. So the first one I have is from a sector growth predicted for 2021, what assumptions were made with regard to lockdown lengths? I think you may have touched on that. There's a bit of uncertainty about that. 5th of March, yes, hopefully, but it's likely to go on beyond that.
Yes, so whenever we produced these forecasts, this was at the time of whenever the lockdown was in place until at least the first week of February. So the fact that we've had that extension probably does add some more downside risk around the numbers presented here. I think that what I've shown here is probably still a reasonable estimate of where we might see growth get to. But I think if we were to see further extensions of the lockdown into the second quarter, that's where we might see a more significant weakening, because as I've touched on, we do have in our numbers a contraction in Q1 activity, but from Q2 is where we start to see that recovery coming through. So if this lockdown were to move into the second quarter of the year, then we might start to see the outlook weakening a bit more from what's been positioned here.
Yeah, just a general comment from last year's analysis that you showed there. Like when we did open up a little bit in the economy, there was a huge pent-up demand there, and that was seen in the numbers that you showed as well. So if there is a bit of a positive trend here, it will open up the economy and people will spend. Okay, they may be cautious, a bit more cautious, but there is a pent-up demand there, which is a very positive thing. I remember we saw an article there in the Republic of Ireland. I mentioned to you yesterday, I think, Conor, about the 1.6 billion euro that's on savings in the Republic of Ireland accounts. And like obviously people have money and they're waiting to spend that and just looking for the opportunity to do it. So I'm sure there's an equivalent in Northern Ireland as well. Obviously not that size, but there's going to be a pent-up demand there. People will want to spend if the environment is right, I guess, and there's a bit of confidence. A lot wrapped around the vaccine, I think you mentioned as well. But just interesting, there was a question that came in here as well. You mentioned about risk, coronavirus, Brexit, and the global economy. And look, any one of those would be difficult to deal with in the best of times. But the question was more specific about Brexit. Could you contribute the Brexit element to those three issues as a portion of, or did you do any analysis on that, the impact of Brexit solely on the economy?
So we don't have a number that says Brexit has contributed X or Y into this particular drop. But I think the fact that businesses are having to spend time and effort and money adapting to the changes that this has brought about, and the disruption that we're seeing is likely to constrain the pace of economic growth in the short term. I think it's important when we're thinking about Brexit to recognise sort of the short-term and longer-term effects. And most of the longer-term economic modelling has been done, has suggested that Brexit would have relative to a scenario in which we had remained in the EU, would be negative for the UK economy. And part of that longer term aspect is effectively, as you erect trade frictions, you make it more difficult for businesses to operate. It's the converse of agreeing free trade deals to try and stimulate business activity. When you add more restriction, it has the opposite effect, and that tends to be a longer term impact. In the short term, it's just managing the disruption that we're perhaps seeing now at the border, and businesses having to work through new processes and spend the time learning how they're going to do that. That is taking perhaps focus away from how they build back from the recovery, for example. So I can't put a number to it and say of the contraction or of the growth, this is how much is attributed to it, but it is one of the factors that we see weighing on the pace of the recovery as we go through on a short-term basis here in 2021.
Okay, and thanks for that, Conor. Another question here. What are your thoughts on inbound tourism with focus on GB market and potential restrictions on cross-border travel? I'm not sure you can answer that one, but
yeah, I think if we consider it we consider it more broadly, prior to the pandemic, tourism was an area in which the Northern Ireland economy was really benefiting from. So if we think before the pandemic began, in the years leading up to it, tourism was something that our economy was really drawing some benefits from. And that was, and there were a number of events over the last number of years that contributed and supported to that. So, with the likes of the Open Golf Tournament a couple of years ago, we had the tourism associated with Game of Thrones. I think we had, if memory serves, I think Titanic Belfast was named as the world's leading tourist attraction at one stage, and we were starting to get, we're starting to build up a bit of a head of steam in attracting inbound tourism into Northern Ireland. Like pretty much every country in the world at the minute, tourism has definitely taken a hit as the results of the pandemic, and I think the expectation would be that that's going to take some time to come back. So I think, again, from a Northern Ireland perspective, it's going to be more about how do we return to that momentum that we had before the pandemic, recognizing that it's going to take some time before we are actually able to do that, given the restrictions on international travel that we currently have in place. But I think it is an interesting area, and one that should be a focus for us, as we had built up quite a bit of momentum and we're reaping the benefits prior to the pandemic of tourism, and probably there was more that we could do. And so it's how do we pick that up again once it's safe to do so, once we're out the back of the pandemic, and hopefully that's something that we'll be able to do. But it was definitely a growth area before the pandemic, and hopefully it will be again in the future for us.
And I know there's a lot of work going on in the background with tourism, and I trying to put up plans as well, particularly in the last half of the year, to see how can they stimulate that whole sector as well. So we'll keep an eye out for those as well. Another question here, which I was surprised with too, and it's been spotted here as well, the resilience of the housing market. I was surprised by it, and obviously Redmond, who sent that question in, I was obviously surprised by it too. I think around the Jerry Strabane area is like 1 or 2% growth year on year, which was surprising really, considering I thought that the house prices would drop. Actually, there's been remarkably solid.
Yeah, the housing market's been a really interesting one throughout 2020, because, if we just contextualize things, we've had the deepest recession in centuries. We've had looming unemployment coming ahead of us. We've had a lot of people having to rely on government support during the pandemic, and businesses as well. But yet the housing market has proved relatively resilient to it, and a lot of what economics tells us should happen to the housing market in that type of an environment has not yet come to pass. And it feels as if, obviously we've got likes of the stamp duty holiday and things which have played into that, but it feels as if perhaps some non-economic factors are driving the housing market performance that we've seen. So people starting to take a view of, well, if I'm going to be working from home for a prolonged period of time, or maybe going to spend, even once the pandemic's behind us, a bit more time working at home than I would have done. People looking to move into properties that have that office space or have that garden space, or perhaps are a little bit outside of the city centres that they would have lived in before. And some of those other factors, rather than the economic ones, are perhaps driving some of the demand for housing that we have seen. I haven't presented any house price forecasts today, but if I look at the expectations for the housing market, certainly at a UK level, over the next year or two, there's a wide range of them. I think it's fair to say the balance is probably that most people expect there to be some decline in house prices as the labour market impacts of the pandemic start to be felt. So once the furlough scheme comes to an end and unemployment unfortunately begins to rise, the stamp duty holiday will have come to pass and will have ended as well. I think the expectation across most economists would be that we would see some decline in house prices after that period, and I think that's probably what we're likely to see there. It's hard to put a number on it, just because of the fact that those other factors have played quite a big role in the performance of the housing market so far. But it is definitely interesting that we've gone through so much of 2020 without those factors biting just yet. But I suspect as we get a bit further into 21, we'll probably see that.
And anecdotally, I know there are people who were looking at investing in properties closer to the cities and have decided, you know what, let's just pull back here now and stay closer to home rather than actually making that investment. They were saving deposits for houses and they've decided to wait. And potentially maybe stay because of the hybrid working that inevitably is going to happen more as time goes on. Thanks for that one. Have you factored in a possible government COVID recovery investment plan, and how likely is it that this investment will take place and will be significant?
Yeah, so I think this is a good question, and perhaps I've seen another couple of questions coming up there around different tax policies and perhaps ahead of the March budget. So if I maybe just take a few comments on the round on that. The Chancellor will be delivering his budget in the first week of March, and I suspect there's probably going to be two competing factors at play there. So the first is the extent to which the Chancellor continues to focus on using the public finances to support the recovery, and the second is how he goes about restoring the stability of the public finances given the large government borrowing that we've had to see during the pandemic. I think an important context to add to that is just what's happened to interest rates. So interest rates, even I've talked about the Bank of England policy rate, but even government bond interest rates, for example, are very low at the minute, and so the likes of your big body like the IMF and the OECD are very much of the view that with government borrowing costs over a long period of time so low, that the focus should be on continuing to support the economy at this stage while government debt can be serviced at low interest rates, rather than rushing to restore the public finances to stability too quickly and actually choking off the recovery. I suspect that in the March budget, the Chancellor's focus will probably weigh slightly more towards supporting the economic recovery. There may be some signals towards the decisions that will have to be taken in the future around restoring the public finances, whether he announces some consultations into future tax rises or changes, whether he announces something in the March budget about an actual change rather than a consultation. I'm not sure. He might, but I think in the short term, particularly given when this budget happens, in the early part of March, we're still going to be in lockdown. I think the focus is more going to be on supporting the economy from the recovery. In terms of an investment plan itself, it was prior to the pandemic, whenever the government came into office, a large part of the focus there was on levelling up, and part of that was going to focus on things like investment in infrastructure, for example, across different regions of the UK. And we've even seen the likes of the city deals in Northern Ireland as well. So I suspect that will still be a focus of government. Whether the size and scale of that changes given the impact that the pandemic has had on the public finances, I'm not sure, possibly. But again, on the flip side of that, it might be a good way to try and boost the economic recovery there. So there's not an explicit one in the forecast of X billion pounds, whatever the case might be. But the expectation within that is that, as I mentioned, I think it was the one green arrow I had on my slide of factors likely to impact. the economy over the next year, that government support and fiscal policy is something that we factored in as having a positive impact and trying to help the economy take hold. And I think over 2021 as a whole, that's where the focus of government spending will be, is supporting that recovery to really get underway.
Thanks, Conor, for that. Another question there: where do you see potential opportunities for business investment in NI from the unique Brexit position of NI with access to both GB and EU markets? I know there has been a lot of discussion, obviously, of the challenges that are there from the paperwork point of view and the protocol and so on, but there obviously are opportunities there, the unfettered access to the European market and that. Just what do you think the potential opportunities there for business are? Are you hearing that people are thinking about that at this stage, or just working through the challenges of the minute?
I think at this stage, my sense would be that businesses are more working through the challenges at this point. But it's a fair point that there is that unfettered access there into both the UK and the EU single market. And I had seen a couple of articles over the weekend there with people saying, talking about perhaps GB firms opening up in the EU, and some comments saying, well, what about Northern Ireland actually as a way to do that? And are there going to be opportunities there? Yes, perhaps there will. But I think at the stage where we're at now, businesses in Northern Ireland, and I think businesses in the rest of the UK as well, are probably most focused on just working through this initial short-term disruption. I think once that levels off to some extent, then as all businesses do, they will start thinking about, okay, where might there be opportunities for us in this? And for Northern Ireland, is there a potential to attract businesses who want to be able to access both the UK market and the EU market? Hopefully there will be. I think just how that's going to manifest itself is yet to come out. And when we are early days into this new relationship, we're not a month into it yet. So it's probably going to take a little bit of time for that to start to come to fruition. And as I say, I think the challenge, the focus now tends to be just managing through those changes that are coming about. Well, there may be opportunities given that there is that access to two markets for businesses that it works for. So, we've seen that perhaps for those businesses in Northern Ireland that have heavy reliance on GB firms in their supply chain that are facing some of those difficulties, for a business thinking about accessing into the EU, but again might be very GB focused in their supply chain, then there's a question of would some of those challenges, if they were in Northern Ireland to facilitate the supply chain, outweigh the market opportunity of where their end selling destination could be. So it'll be business specific, depending on the supply chain and their point of sale. But I think as time passes, we'll start to see if there are opportunities there, and if Northern Ireland's in a position to leverage them. But I think it'll be a little while before we know.
Yes, there was a question here as well about construction, an important sector to Northern Ireland and the Northwest, and sharing your insights on the sector and how the local housing market may be impacted throughout 2021. I think you've touched on that already. Anything you want to add to that, Conor, at this stage?
Yeah, so I suppose I would just say, from a 2021 perspective, our expectation is the construction sector will expand by with 5.7% was our number in the table, and I think that's reflecting partly, as I've touched on, the fact that construction is still open at the minute. So it's not closed in the way it was during the lockdown in 2020, and that will help to support that reasonably strong projection for economic activity in 2021.
Brilliant. Okay, another question here. Do you feel government support needs to extend beyond what's currently proposed in order to allow business to repair diminished reserves and protect cash flows as businesses recover?
I think it's one of these things where we've seen the likes of the government lending schemes that have been brought out. We've seen some of the different grants that have been brought out. We've seen the likes of the rates holidays. So I think it's just I think from a policy perspective, the question is going to be, how long do those existing mechanisms remain in place for? We may see new policies brought in. I'm not sure. I think it's going to depend on how quickly the recovery starts to take hold. But I suspect from a policy making perspective, and given that we're in this lockdown now, sometimes it's easier to extend a pre-existing policy to develop something new. And so I think the big question is just the extent to which some of the things we already have in place might be extended for a little bit longer, and that will depend on how quickly we can start to reopen the economy again. But there is the potential that some of the things which are currently in place might be extended a bit more, just again to support that recovery to take hold.
Yes, and there's so much invested in it now. At this stage, you'd be ashamed to think that we're going to pull back on the supports. Yeah. I think we're in it for the long haul. I'd like to feel anyway. Another question here came in relation to VAT. What does Conor believe will happen in relation to VAT rate in March budget for hospitality sector? Does he believe it will remain at 5%?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think I suppose I just go back to some of the points I made on the round. And that one, it's going to depend on what the Chancellor's overall perspective on the budget is. Will that stay at that particular rate? I don't really know. Will the balance be on supporting economic activity? I think so. And the fact that hospitality is one of the most impacted sectors, and the sector that has perhaps been closed the longest amount of time, you would suspect that it will be that will be recognised in whatever policy measures are put in place, whether it's through a continuation of the current VAT rates or something else. I'm not so sure. I don't know, but I do think the balance for the sector and for the wider economy will be on supporting businesses.
Okay, good stuff, Conor. If we see default on loans, which is expected going forward, how will that affect the outlook? And that was from Dawn there, the question.
Yeah, I suppose this comes down to it's almost a similar piece to the unemployment side, is that on the consumer side, the government policy measures that we have seen in place have protected jobs. They have limited the labour market impacts of the pandemic, but the expectation would be that those impacts will be felt, and that's going to constrain the pace of economic activity. On a business side, it's probably a similar story to, unfortunately, business insolvencies. Are there businesses that have been supported through the last number of months through the different government schemes and the way furlough has protected people? But yet when these policies come to an end, they may not still be able to operate. And I think the expectation is that unemployment will rise, and unfortunately still will business insolvencies. I think some of that, as I talked on the unemployment side, it is factored into what I'm showing here. But again, on the flip side, if that were to be even larger than assumed, then you would have adverse impacts on the economy. So it's again, if you have less people working, you're producing less economic activity, your rate of economic growth slows. If you have less businesses in operation, it's the same thing. You're producing less activity, your rate of economic growth slows. So I think the extent to which unemployment rises and business insolvencies rises is going to depend on what we see when those schemes come to an end. But if that were to be significantly more than would be expected, then that tends to be adverse for economic growth.
Okay, pretty interesting question here. How would you describe your predictions of the economy coming out of COVID compared to what our economy looked like during the construction crash, which took us approximately 10 years to recover from? So the bounce back, I guess, how long?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Yeah, I'd hate to think it was 10 years. I want to leave this webinar on a high.
I don't think it'll be 10 years. So if we think back to the chart that I showed, which had us to the end of 2021, you'll see we were still a bit lower than pre-virus activity levels. I think it's probably going to take a couple of years. I'm hopeful it won't be as long as 10 years. Similar to what we saw previously, perhaps. So I do think it's going to take a couple of years, hopefully not as long as it has in the past.
Yeah, and certainly looking at aviation and things like that, there's going to be a slow return to that for sure. If you look at that as a specific sector, which has an impact on tourism and everything else that wraps around that. Another question, if Foyport achieves Freeport status, how might this power business growth and activity in the Northwest?
So this is not an area I know an awful lot about on the Freeport side of things. So there's probably not an awful lot of insight that I can add in it. Like I suppose it's just a case of, we've talked about some of the city deals and other things. Any mechanisms that provide ways to stimulate activity will obviously be beneficial from an economic growth perspective. So I don't know enough about the details to say too much on it, I'm afraid. But as I mentioned, any measures that we have that tend to create business opportunities are, of course, beneficial from a growth perspective.
Thanks, Conor. Do you see the potential for increased inflation following a recovery in 2021?
Yes, so I do see inflation running higher in 2021 than it did in 2020. So on 2020 as a whole, inflation ran at 0.9% for the year overall. For 2021, we expect it to be about 1.4% overall on average over the year. And part of that is as we see consumer spending hopefully recurrent from Q2 onwards, and we see the increase in demand for goods, which has an upward impact on prices. I think it's probably also reflective of the fact that there are higher costs at the minute, again associated with the wider pandemic. I think it's given the disruption that's out there. That I think it is a bit more expensive, like shipping goods and stuff at the minute, and so some of that will likely pass on to consumers. But I think perhaps one of the biggest driver on the inflation side is going to be with what happens on the consumer side of consumer demand and price increases. And I would expect to see inflation picking up as we go through 2021. On average over the year, I don't think it's going to be at the Bank of England's 2% target yet, which is again part of the reason why we see interest rates remaining on hold. But that 1.4 for the year on average probably suggests at the end of 2021 we're a bit closer to that 2%.
Yeah, and this is probably the most serious question that I've had in the whole chat here now is, when do you think we'll be able to go for a pint in a pub, and what are you having?
Yes, I saw that one come up. So unfortunately, I don't think I can give you a date. I think it's a question that a lot of people are asking at the minute. I think it's probably for the question that I used to get whenever I would have done all these webinars and economic outlook discussions in the past was always what's going to happen to the value of the pound. And as an economist, there's three questions that you're sort of told that you can never really answer because it can't really be done, which is what's going to happen to exchange rates, stock markets, and commodity prices. And so my stock answer was always, if I knew what was going to happen to the value of the pound, I probably wouldn't be here today.
Yeah.
I'm starting to think that the next question that I might start getting asked at all these is, when can I go to the pub?
Yeah. So you're going to duck that one by sounds, yeah. You're going to duck that one. Okay, no, fair enough. I just have a couple of more questions here, and then we'll wrap it up if that's okay, Conor.
Yeah.
Let me just see now. Yeah, looking beyond the pandemic and Brexit, what areas would you like to see policy focusing on to improve the performance of the Northern Ireland economy?
Yeah, and I think this is a good thing for us to think about, because hopefully as we move through the challenges that we've all faced over the last year or so with the pandemic and Brexit, we do need to think about Northern Ireland's long-term economic potential. And there are a few areas that I know, that I've certainly written about in the past in newspaper articles and things. So one of them is productivity. And productivity is effectively the amount of output that each worker produces in an hour of work. And from if we begin UK overall, in the years following the financial crisis, the UK has lagged the other G7 large advanced economies in terms of productivity growth. In Northern Ireland, productivity, so output per hour, has been on average over the last 20 years or so, just under 20% lower than it has been in the overall UK. So we have lagged behind an economy that has lagged behind other advanced economies. So this is very much an area that we need to focus on in Northern Ireland. And the sort of textbook answer to improving productivity is to invest in skills and education. So equipping people with the right skills that they need to be doing the right jobs for them. Investing in infrastructure, which effectively brings labour markets together. It makes it easier for people to commute to where the job that best suits them might be. It makes it easier for businesses to get their goods to market, or for services firms to access those other industries and those other potential market areas. And I think, and also expanding into global markets, and that can either be through, sometimes it's having links or partnerships with other global firms where you can learn from best practice, or having to compete in global markets forces you to raise your game, because your competition's not just the business across the road from you now. It can be a business in France or Germany or Brazil or wherever else it might be. So I think a focus on productivity is a very important part of it. The second one I would perhaps point to is economic inactivity rates. So in Northern Ireland, if we look, we've talked today about the unemployment rate, and the unemployment rate is the most commonly talked about labour market indicator. But to really understand what's happening in the labour market, you really want to look at three measures, which is the employment rate, so the portion of the population in work; the unemployment rate, which is the proportion of people who want to be in work and are looking for a job but aren't in work at the time; and economic inactivity, which is people who aren't in a job and aren't looking for work. And in Northern Ireland, our economic inactivity rate is about 27%. It's the highest of the 12 regions in the UK. I think the UK inactivity rate's just under 21% at the minute. Again, similar to productivity, this has been a long-standing issue impacting the Northern Ireland economy. And whenever you dive into those figures, there's actually a reasonably large chunk of people who are economically inactive who would like to be working. So I think it's how do we support those people to get into employment? And I think that would potentially be an area that could help to stimulate economic activity in Northern Ireland, is if we can get that big cohort of people who want to be in work, but for whatever reason at this stage can't do so, into the labour market. And then my third focus would be, and I sort of touched on it in the productivity piece, is how Northern Ireland competes internationally. So how do we encourage businesses here to export, to sell their goods and services in other global markets, to compete in an international economy? And we have lots of excellent businesses who already do this really well, and they really do stand above the competition across the world. And it's just how do we encourage more of the businesses who really have captured a strong market share in Northern Ireland and in parts of the UK, and really are doing excellent and innovative things, to go even further beyond that and start conducting business internationally. So I think they would be my sort of three areas that I would be focusing on if I think about looking beyond the pandemic and Brexit, in terms of how do we really stimulate the Northern Ireland economy.
No, that's really fascinating stuff there, Conor. I didn't realise that economic activity was that high at 27%.
Yeah.
And that really goes back to the productivity issue about the matching this, the skills education to match what jobs are out there to be done. And there's a mismatch, obviously, between what potential jobs are there and the skills in the general workforce. Yeah. So I know we've talked a lot about apprenticeships, and we would now be a big supporter of those. We're doing a project at the moment actually to try and match businesses and apprentices together, working with the Department of Economy and the council as well. So yeah, a big chunk of work there to try and match those two things together. Look, I think I'm just gone through all the questions. I don't think I have any more in the chat here. Look, it's been really fascinating, Conor, and thank you so much. I felt like you were a bit like mastermind sitting in the chair with the lights on, and your special subject is, and no doubt your special subject is the economy and everything that goes with it, Conor. Really appreciate your time. Feedback here, brilliant, Conor, very comprehensive. And if there are any other questions that people would like to ask that didn't have a chance today, please send them on to us and we'll fire them on to Conor and we'll get some replies back to you. Just lots of, thanks, Conor, brilliant webinar coming in here as well. So really a lot of people very, very thankful that you joined us today, Conor. Is there anything particular you'd like to add just before we wrap up? Yeah, no, I'd just like to say a big thank you to you, Paul, for the invite to come and speak to you, and particularly a big thank you to everybody who came on the webinar. And I mean, the engagement that we've had over this last half hour has been really brilliant. And sometimes whenever you come on these things, it's you don't always get that Q&A, and I think we've had a really great discussion here as well, and I've really enjoyed it. So just a thank you to you, Paul, for the invite, and a thank you to everyone who took part for really engaging and asking some great questions. So thank you very much. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Conor. To somebody just mentioned about the slides there. So certainly, can we get a copy of the slides, Conor? Is that okay? Can we send them out to our members? Yeah, certainly. So we can do that. Yeah. We also have a recording of this morning's event as well that we can send out to our members as well. and we'll do that afterwards, shortly afterwards. So yeah, any information that was there, we'll share with you for sure. So Conor, look, just one last thanks again. Really, really informative, and keep up the great work.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care now. Bye.
Bye.